What do you call a superhero with a day job in graphic design? Well, how about Vector Man? Released in fall 1995 for the Sega Genesis/Sega Mega Drive, Vector Man is a side-scrolling shooter that was developed by Blue Sky Software and is considered the by then aging Sega Genesis's answer to the Donkey Kong Country series due to its use of similarly pre-rendered 3D graphics. The game features an eco-conscious narrative where Earth has been abandoned by humans due to years of neglect and pollution, leaving behind machines with the sole purpose of cleaning up after them. One of these machines, named Raster, is ultimately driven insane by and fused with a nuclear weapon, becoming a maniacal dictator named Warhead who wants to kill any and all humans that dare return to his Earth. This leads to the game's titular hero, Vector Man, beginning a mission to rid the Earth of Warhead and to restore peace to the planet. I grew up playing this game a lot as a kid via the Sega Smash Pack on PC. And while the emulation was never perfect, I do remember games like Altered Beast, Golden Axe, and Vector Man really standing out to me at the time. That's not to say that I ever really got that far into this game though. I was a 4 or 5-year-old who had no idea what they were doing and was playing this game with a keyboard, which honestly just sounds like a terrible time looking back at it. At the time of its release, Vector Man was praised for the incredible mileage that it got out of Sega's 16-bit hardware, with critics almost unanimously concluding that it was a great title and a wonderful swan song for the Genesis. And I've gotta agree with the critics on this one. Despite the fact that I never got past the first level of this game, it did leave a lasting impression on me. But does it hold up? While Vector Man was an incredibly impressive and unique 16-bit title back in 1995, there's no denying that this game is also pretty heavily rooted in the 90s. And much like a lot of things from back then, it's kinda easy to assume that this game probably hasn't aged well. However, you'd actually be wrong to assume that. Almost 26 years later, Vector Man is still a total blast, with incredible animation and art design, a catchy techno soundtrack, and a variety of gameplay styles. And it manages to do this in spite of a couple of problems that range from fairly subjective to a little negligent on the part of the developers. Before we continue though, a quick question of the day. What is the first game you remember being extremely impressed by? Like, to the point of having your mind get blown by how fun or visually incredible the title itself was. And if you can't think of the first game you remember blowing your mind, how about a game in general that you hold near and dear to you? For me, it's gotta be playing Final Fantasy IX when I was 7 or 8. While I was way too young to even get past the first hours of the game, it had a huge effect on me and always stood out as being one of the coolest games that I'd ever seen. And about a year and a half ago, I ended up picking it up again for my Nintendo Switch, where it became my favorite game of all time. Feel free to drop a comment answering the question of the day. I'd love to hear a bit about your answer. And with that said and done, on with the video. Vector Man features 16 stages of shooting action, with the vast majority of them taking place in a standard side-scrolling format, while also deviating from this style from time to time for a few different types of pseudo-3D-inspired levels. In that regard, the game is somewhat like the Traveler's Tales developed Toy Story, which came out a month later and is also an impressive pseudo-3D side-scroller that incorporates different gameplay styles. On a standard stage, Vector Man has a relatively simple gameplay loop that revolves around exploring and reaching the end of the level while disposing of enemies and bosses along the way. To do this, you'll need to gun down your opponents either with Vector Man's default gun or with several other temporary weapons that he can procure from TV units scattered across each level. These power-ups come in the form of stuff like a shotgun-based spread shot, a machine gun, and this kinda cool ball twirly thing that reminds me of that one weapon Batman has. I think it's called a bolo. So yeah, there's some trivia for you. There's also a pretty cool set of power-ups that can transform your character into stuff like a drill, a bomb, or a fish, I guess. It's honestly a lot like the Wisps from Sonic Colors, and none of these power-ups seem to last too long anyway, so for the majority of your playthrough, you'll probably just be using your semi-automatic standard attack. Which, total side note, just be ready for some thumb cramps if you tend to be prone to those because you're going to be hitting that button a lot.
Kyle? Kyle! Dude, what's wrong? Carpal tunnel! Carpal tunnel! It's... Oh, Jesus, he's got it bad.
And maybe consider using a turbo controller or function on an emulator if possible. And while we're on the subject of things to look out for, I'd also recommend approaching this game with caution if you're sensitive to flashing lights, as the game features screen flashing whenever you complete certain actions, such as blowing up a TV. Despite my media production degree, I'm no expert on what is or isn't broadcast safe, but blowing a TV up in this game does result in the screen flashing about 7 or 8 times within the span of a second, and that's actually pretty dangerous and reckless if you're exposed to it for prolonged periods of time. The World Wide Web Consortium states that a flashing image shouldn't flash more than 3 times in the span of a second. I happen to be pretty photosensitive due to some health issues I've been dealing with, so I honestly just would close my eyes whenever I'd blow a TV up in the game in order to avoid overstimulating myself. And it sucks, yeah, but it's better than the alternative, am I right? Vectorman runs at a blistering 60 frames per second, and as a result of this, the game feels buttery smooth in a way that seriously complements the gameplay. In fact, Vectorman's lead programmer, Richard Karp, described the game's high frame rate as well as the animation that it allowed for way better than I ever could. In a delightfully retro interview with GameZero.com, he said,
"The fact that the animation runs so fast allows the game to respond to controls very quickly, so you don't get any delay between the time you hit a button and the animation response. Plus, we designed everything so there was minimum delay. There is no wind-up animation for shooting. That wind-up would take time between the button press and the response, and I didn't want that to happen."
Simply put, the game's controls are as responsive as they get. And that responsiveness, as well as the amount of animation everything has in this game and Vectorman's sound design, result in the game feeling really good to play. Despite the lack of force feedback on the Sega Genesis, you can really get a sense for how powerful your weapon is, especially when you can visually see your enemies recoil as they take damage. Though, if I'm being honest, I'm not the biggest fan of the rogues gallery that you're put up against in this game. It's not that these enemies are poorly designed or anything, it's just that their characterization feels a bit empty and lacking, although their design isn't always perfect. While most enemies go down after a flurry of shots make contact with them, others may require a bit more strategy, such as by targeting a weak point. However, and this could just be me, I didn't feel like this was particularly well telegraphed, especially since we're only talking about 1 or 2 enemies here. Aside from that, the game's enemies are mostly inoffensive and not all that memorable, except for these wasp enemies that are literally everywhere. They usually go down in one hit, but due to there often being several of them, it can be pretty easy to get caught off guard and swarmed by them. Anyway, Vectorman has some pretty decent level design going for it. I won't mince my words when I say it's nothing to write home about, but it gets the job done and maintains a relatively cozy linear structure for most of the ride. It does deviate from this a bit too much for my liking in the later half of the game though, as the levels grow more maze-like in a way that I don't necessarily think works all that well. It's not that I don't mind non-linearity in games, it's just that I don't feel like it does the player any favors here due to Vectorman also having a time limit on each stage, as well as featuring 0 continues. Oh yeah, Vectorman doesn't feature continues. Honestly, while some may find this sort of thing endearing or part of the fun of retro gaming, I've never been all too keen on it. In my opinion, not offering continues to players is usually little more than a way to artificially inflate the difficulty or length of a game. And because Vectorman features several levels that change the main gameplay style and offer the player little time to figure out what's going on, I'd hardly call its inclusion in this game fair. Thankfully though, Vectorman does offer a number of different difficulties that are, charmingly labeled with 90s vernacular. For first-time players or people who want a bit more of a laid-back playthrough, I recommend going with this game's easy mode, which I refuse to acknowledge as being lame.
Hi, would you like to change the difficulty?
Yeah, I'd like to play on easy, please.
Do you mean lame?
No, I mean easy.
Easy is lame.
No, easy is easy.
Look, Dick, easy is lame.
While I initially played through this game on easy, I did eventually manage to get through a healthy chunk of the game on its standard difficulty, and I found it to be a pretty fair and reasonable challenge, continues aside. And after doing so, I can't help but conclude that difficulty-wise, Vectorman is honestly just more punishing than it is difficult. Still, it's an extremely playable game with tight gameplay and excellent performance. Visually, the game is also stunning. As I've already said a few times before, Vectorman makes use of 3D-style graphics that are somewhat similar to what's on display in Donkey Kong Country. As a result of this, the game's character and environmental sprites look incredible for something on 16-bit hardware. The game's backgrounds also feature layers upon layers of parallax scrolling, which help add to the incredible sense of depth in the game. And that's before even bringing up the number of straight-up incredible visual effects on display here. You can really tell that Blue Sky Software had a total mastery of the hardware that they were working with, what with it being so late into the Genesis's lifespan. As for the visual style itself, I think the best way to describe it is that it looks and feels a lot like the Brandon Lee movie The Crow after it's been put in a blender with a bunch of 90s existentialist sci-fi movies like The Matrix or the ever-so-on-the-nosely titled eXistenZ. Oh, and maybe a hint of Lawnmower Man. But in a good way. What I guess I'm trying to say is that Vectorman may just be a bit too 90s at points. Now, don't get me wrong, I love the 90s as much as the next guy, but even I have my limits. And while I can take this game at face value and love it for its grungy aesthetic, I can totally see how that same aesthetic may be a huge turnoff for some players. Still, I do commend the game on being very visually clear and for having well-defined layers and easy to identify color choices to separate objects. And since I just mentioned how 90s the game looks, I think it's only fair to bring up how 90s its soundtrack is at the same time. It's got a number of really awesome and exciting electronic tracks in it that are genuinely catchy and stand up as being not just good and appropriate video game music, but solid electronic music to begin with. This is partly due to the Sega Genesis's sound hardware, which has been criticized over the years for being relatively limited. But in the case of Vectorman, it's put to good use. The game's music is heavy on funky beats, arpeggios, and mixing what sounds like organ sounds with saw synths, which are all things that the Genesis is quite adept at. For those unaware of how sound works on the Sega Genesis, a lot of its games were developed using a sound driver known as GEMS, which stands for Genesis Editor for Music and Sound Effects. GEMS was developed to be an easier and more hands-on way for Western developers and musicians to wrap their hands around creating sound on the FM synth-based hardware of the Sega Genesis. And unfortunately, while GEMS did a great job at making things easier for developers from a workflow point of view, it often led to games having that patented Sega Genesis farty sound. But that isn't really the case here though, for while Vectorman did use GEMS to create its music and sound effects, the devs were clearly comfortable with the technology and were able to produce arrangements that played to its strengths. A lot of this game's music works in the same way that the game's visuals do for me. They're undeniably dated, but full of charm because of it, and in that sense, it kinda reminds me of the really cheap MIDI music from games like RuneScape or shows like Rugrats. So does Vectorman hold up? While I've spent a lot of this review poking fun at how utterly 90s it is, as well as sharing my misgrievances with the lack of continues in the game, I gotta say, yeah, this late Genesis title totally holds up. It's got some really addictive and easy to pick up gameplay, wonderful and hardware-pushing visuals, and an extremely solid 16-bit soundtrack. While I do think that the game could have done with being a bit more accessible, as well as featuring a few less flashing lights, I still found myself having a lot of fun with this one. I don't know if I'd go as far as to put this amongst my favorite Genesis games or anything, but Vectorman is still a great title and a fairly affordable one to boot. If you're looking for a side-scrolling shooter with a healthy mix of fun and different gameplay styles, you really can't go wrong with picking up Vectorman. And with that said and done, that brings us to the end of today's video. If you haven't answered the question of the day yet and are feeling up to it, I'd love to hear your answer over in the comments. On top of that, if you have any games you'd love to hear my thoughts on in a future review, please just feel free to let me know in the comments or over on Twitter or Instagram. You could check out my profile on both those sites by following the link in the description or by searching for Niche Plays on those respective sites. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and that if you decide to give Vectorman a go, you have a great time doing so. So yeah, bye.